9:30. It's 9:30. Yay! Good morning, our remote sites. How are you? And all our online participants. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to the Sierra Learning Community. We have a great topic today that we're going to talk about. I want to just warn everybody, I have a slight delay on my slides moving. So I'm going to try to be ahead of the game, but let's see. We counted 5 seconds. Oh, there we go. So my name is Barbara DeGraff. I am your learning community facilitator, and it's a pleasure to be here. We have a great group, and I think we're going to have a really, really wonderful morning. I hope everybody had snacks, ready to listen and learn. We're going to talk about housing, affordability, and accessibility. And we have 2 great speakers. We have Chris Martin. Say hi, Chris. Yay! Those of you in the remote sites can't see him, but you'll see him soon. And we have Cheyenne Purrington. And Chris is from Homeless, California, and Cheyenne Purrington is our county, my county, El Dorado County, South Lake Tahoe, Tahoe Coalition for the Homeless. She's our new executive director. So we're very excited to have her. Strategies, I think most of you know strategies by now. Yay! Here's my wonderful team. Carrie Collins. Yay, Carrie! Always calm and keeping me calm when we're having technical difficulties. And Shane Meserve, who is also trying to keep me calm. It takes a village to calm me down. And Shane is also manning or womaning, as the case may be, the chat box. So very important for our online participants, for our remote sites. Make sure that if you have a question, you either raise your hand or you use the chat box or you do both. And we will make sure to get you into the meeting and get your questions answered to the best of our ability. I know. And this one takes even longer. So Strategies has a number of services that we provide, including trainings, webinars, and I want to make sure that everybody had a chance to look at our handout, listed handout number 1 in your packets. It is a list of the webinars for the next 5 months of Strategies, taking us through to the end of June. So we have some great offerings.
And there will be more to come.
And more webinars?
Yes, there will be more to come.
Okay. According to Carrie, there will be more to come. So feel free to sign up. Everything that we do is free. And if you have not already signed up on our website, strategiesca.org, do so, because then you'll get our newsletter. And we have folks today participating from the 10 Sierra counties, but we also have folks from Sacramento, folks from Butte County, an old friend, Sarah Frohock. I don't know if she's on the call, but she had signed up. So we have folks from all over the state, and you too can participate all over the state for free in other learning communities that might be of interest to you. So it's just something to keep in mind. And make sure you subscribe to the Strategies YouTube channel, because all of our learning communities are taped. You can watch them again and again if you want to get a laugh, perhaps, or you want to learn. All our webinars are available, so you can use them in staff meetings, things of that nature. So it's a great, great resource. And our funder is the Office of Child Abuse Prevention. Thanks to them, we're able to provide this free of charge to all of you. So we thank OCAP for that. If you use social media, these are some hashtags that you can use to try to promote our events. The more people we have involved in the learning communities, the better. That's what puts the community in learning community. So our goal today, start and end on time. We started at 9:30. Woohoo! Goal 1. We want you to participate as much as possible. We know that it's hard sometimes in these events, especially for our online people and our remote folks, but please, if you have questions, raise your hand. For my friends here in the hub in Jackson, one of the things to know is that my microphone does not project me in this room. I rely on my loud voice for that. It's projecting me to the online folks and the remote folks. So we ask, if you have a question, just raise your hand and we will run over with the microphone. And that way you can ask your question so that the folks online can hear, okay? So it's a little, sometimes it's a little tough, but again, it brings us together as a community. We try to ask you limit your sidebar conversations. We hope to have lots of time at the end to really have a conversation. We will also ask you to silence your cell phones, which I think I did mine. So just put them on vibrate, please. And then practice self-care. I noticed in the restroom, we do have the one restroom used because the little munchkins are using the women's room. So if you just knock, any men, if you would please use the stall, just in case. But practice self-care. There's actually a list of self-care in the bathroom, in the stall. So I was
Hello. I'm going to give her this microphone.
It may just be batteries. Thank you very much. Plan B. Got my microphone. How's that sound, Carrie? Sorry. Okay. Okay. So we have the only really difference between a learning community and a training in my mind is that in a learning community, we try to provide time for you to work together. We honor the wisdom in the room. We hope to provide some really good questions to get you thinking about the topic. So we like to combine learning with actual action steps that you can take. And hopefully by working together and not only listening to each other in this room, but also our remote sites and our online folks, we really can spark some great thinking about the topics. And we have some really, we've had some great outcomes from our learning communities. So that's on your tables, and our remote sites have them as well. And this is your learning community. I've really tried to make sure, what happened here? Excuse me for a moment, technical difficulty. I'm not moving. Okay, yay. So the idea of the learning community is that I get the topics from you guys. So in the past, I've sent out polls, excuse me, and I've had really excellent response from people about what do you want to learn about. And this topic on housing affordability and accessibility came from the region. Clearly, this is an area that's really important to the state of California, but our region is no different. We too, all of us are grappling with this issue. And we hope that you try to think about bringing people to the learning community, bringing folks that maybe you work with normally, inviting other people in so that, again, we get that wisdom in the room and that cross-fertilization of ideas. So we have some ideas about people you might want to invite. Learning community level this fiscal year, but what we've really looked at are two key areas, and they interrelate. So for this year, which is a fiscal year for us, our program year is July until June. We want to focus on building family, agency, and community resilience. And for the first two, we looked at best practices in trauma-informed care. That was September and back in November. And first we looked at serving youth. Then we looked at self-care, not only for us, but also for the people that we work with. And now we're talking about rural policies, hopefully, to improve housing affordability and accessibility. And then the last learning community, we're going to talk about expanding technology in rural communities to support these goals. And I don't have speakers lined up, so if anyone has ideas for who they want to hear from or what they'd like to hear, please feel free to contact me. It's a great way to get speakers in that are relevant to you folks. I have some ideas. One of the things that I'm going to try to do is kind of bring together everything we talked about and see how we can use technology to either support self-care, support youth, support housing, etc. Oh, it's working now. Okay. All right. Thank you. And one of the things also on your tables that I didn't want to copy everyone because I'm trying not to kill too many trees. As I age, I think, I don't want to meet my maker. And it's like, you've killed a million trees with all the paper that you have copied in your life, lady. So on the table, we have a little PowerPoint slide on our practice methods. We've talked about this at each learning community as well. And again, the idea behind this is to think about your work. What is your focus? What area are you trying to impact? And we're going to talk today about some big picture on housing, some legislative impact, that's advocacy, community advocacy. We're going to talk a little bit about identifying vulnerable populations. Think about your area of impact because it can become so overwhelming for us to try to impact everything. But if we think about where we work, what we do, and where our focus is. So that's really what we're trying to emphasize when we talk about the practice methods. And this comes out of the strategies, the Vehicles for Change monograph, which is available online. If anybody needs the website, I can give it to you, but you can get to it from our strategies resource page. It's just one of the many resources that we have available to you on that. And today we're going to talk a little bit about how housing is a factor in child abuse prevention, because that's what we're here for. OCAP funds us, so clearly we have a focus, right? We're going to talk about policies that have contributed to the housing crisis in California. I'm a great believer in history. You know, when we look at where we came from, how did we get here to this crisis? Talk about what's on the horizon on the state and federal level to address housing affordability. So many things, so many resources. But again, when we're done, everything will be sent out to you again in an email with a summary of our discussion today, as well as all the resources that we mentioned. And then we have in your packet, when Chris starts speaking, we're going to look at housing affordability in our area. How do we rate relative to California? So one of your handouts addresses that. We wanted to learn about innovative models to improve housing affordability and accessibility. And I promise you that I tried to find some models, but I think the truth of it is we are going to be creating the models because that's where we're at. If you read the Chronicle, San Francisco Chronicle, you will see they have a whole series on homelessness. They are grappling just tremendously with this. So I think one of the realities for us is it would be nice if we had models, but I think we are going to have to become the model. And then at the end, as we always do in our learning communities, we're going to look at what can we do as family strengthening professionals to help support more affordable and accessible housing in our communities, because we do play a big role in that. The flow for the day, we're doing our welcome. Hopefully you guys got a chance to network and talk to each other. And rather than introductions, I have a question for you that we're going to talk about, and then everybody will report back, because I really want you to think about your work related to housing, related to child abuse prevention. Then we'll have presentations from our wonderful speakers, and then we're going to have the networking time, and then we will adjourn. And we should be adjourning about 12:30. And you do have an agenda in your packet. About 11 o'clock, we'll probably take, when Chris is done with his presentation, we'll take a 5-minute break. Everybody, I'm going to put here at the hub some extra hearty snacks to get us through that last hour and a half, so everybody's not really hungry. And then we'll come back, we'll hear from Cheyenne, and then we'll work on our networking time. Today we have 4 remote sites. Yay! We have Alpine, Markleyville, say hi. Yay! We have Sierra, Loyalton, Tammy. Say hi, Tammy. And Tammy is not alone today. Yay! We're happy for you. We have Bishop. Say hi, Bishop. Yay, Tim. Tim is filling in for Serena and doing a great job. Tim Villanueva. And Mammoth Lakes, Mono County, we have Courtney and a nice group there. Hi, Mammoth Lakes. And then we have about 30 or more online participants. 20 online, nice. And of course, the hub. Yay, the hub. We love the hub. Okay, so you're standing, perfect timing. So what I'd like you to do is in pairs, and you're pretty much perfect here, as well as our remote sites, you can do it in pairs or you can do it just as a team, depending on the number of people. And for our online participants, I'd like you to think about this question, okay? And they can chat into the chat box. The remote sites we will unmute you to hear what if you have something you'd like to share. So I'd like you to think about, and we have a good 10 minutes to talk among ourselves. How has the lack of affordable housing impacted the individuals and families that you work with? So think about that. And then I'm going to ask if anybody's willing to share your observations, just to get us in that mindset for the morning, okay? So starting now, we'll come back together in 10 minutes, which will be 9:56. And then you can report back, just a few of you if you want to. So start sharing. Yay. Same thing, remote sites, online folks. Begin sharing. Great. All right, we're going to come back together. I'm going to cut you off 1 minute early. We have one of our online participants is going to be unmuted to speak to us. Online participant who's actually going to share with us, and we want to be able to hear her. So who is this who's going to share?
Hi, my name's Aurora Packard, and I am in Nevada County. I work for the Friendship Club, and we just took on a pilot program about a year ago for unaccompanied homeless youth. And so in Nevada County, we have about 380 homeless youth in the K through 12 system. That includes McKinney-Vento eligible kids that are, doubled and tripled up or couch surfing with or without their families. And there's about 172 homeless high school students in our county as well. And many of those had been previously homeless with their family and are now out on their own if, the family has to split up. When they become homeless, that oftentimes the teenagers have to go out on their own. So yeah, we know that it's a huge issue in our county. One of the major issues is lack of affordable housing altogether for both families and for these youth, especially ones 16 to 24 that have no rental history, no ability to secure housing. But also we have an extremely low vacancy rate with rental housing stock as well. So I'm also the chair of the housing committee for our COC. And so we're working with HCD and CSH, which I'm sure Chris will mention at some point, to kind of look at housing pipeline development and how do we attract nonprofit developers. We do have Habitat for Humanity up here, but it's our only developer, and they actually only are able to develop for some reason in one area of town and kind of, track housing. And that's not even accessible for everybody. So yeah, I'm excited to hear everybody's thoughts today, and excited to hear Chris Martin speak again. I was lucky enough to hear him speak and got to meet him briefly at Housing California last year, and it was an absolute pleasure. So excited to be here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very good. Very excellent. Excellent resources.
Aurora, this is Shane Meserve. I'm in the hub. Can you tell us what do you define as a homeless student?
Yeah, so the state of California definition and the Department of Ed definition of homelessness is based on McKinney-Vento standards. And I'm sure that Chris can maybe go into this a little bit deeper. So HUD's definition, Housing and Urban Development's definition, is very strict, and it is sheltered or unsheltered. The state of California and the Federal Department of Education has taken a little different spin on that and has looked at homelessness as defined as sheltered or unsheltered, but also can include couch surfing, doubled and tripled up, like Marcella from the Paiute Reservation, overcrowding, multiple families in one home. That's also factors into that definition. Housing insecurity is also part of that. And anybody else want to jump in, correct me if you think there's anything more to add or change with that. But I think that's, yeah, I would look up McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if I guess that was a personal question. I was curious what that was. Yeah, so Marcella Frankson from the Paiute Reservation in Bishops, she said what she's experienced with affordable housing with families, that in some cases families are overcrowded. So they're living with grandparents, parents, siblings, and extended family, and they're emergency housing or temporary housing, but it's still quite a bit. There's not enough emergency housing. So that's what she shared from Bishop.
Okay.
And we also have, let's see, Deborah Kemper, she didn't, she was the caretaker of the Jackson homeless shelter for a year and a half. She herself struggled with homelessness as well. Has been able to find a lower cost housing as well. But that's a struggle there. And then we have Lauren, South Lake Tahoe. She's a home health and hospice nurse in South Lake Tahoe, and lack of housing excludes those that need care from receiving our services.
Right.
I see many patients that are living in motels, and the stress of lack of housing is apparent on their health.
Right.
The ability to get appointments is difficult. The ability to pay for medications and treatment is often the first thing to go when food and shelter are on the line.
Yeah, exactly.
And then Sarah Frohock.
Yay! Hi, Sarah. I used to work with her.
Where is she from?
She's from Butte County.
Butte County. So
Mental
she said
health.
since the campfire, we've seen a major rise in homelessness since Paradise was our primary lower cost rental market.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'll make a comment too. Again, this is Shane in the hub, but I have a friend that I just visited in Three Rivers, which is a small community right at the base of the Sequoia National Park in Tulare County. And she mentioned that in their community, there's so many homes that are used for Airbnbs, for short-term rentals. So then those houses are taken off the market for actual people who live there year-round. That makes a huge impact on the community as well. So there are way fewer people there to be on committees, to be, to actually do community work, because they only come on weekends or in the summer.
Ditto for South Lake Tahoe, same problem. Do you want to, do any of our remote sites want to share what they just talked about? Anybody? Well,
Tim or Janelle?
Tim, Janelle, or Courtney, or Tammy, do you want to share? If you want to, just put your hand up and we'll unmute you. Okay, go ahead. Janelle, you are going to be unmuted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello? Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So we're from Live Violence Free here in Alpine County. So just from a domestic violence perspective or family violence perspective, we don't have any affordable housing such as apartment rental units or anything like that down here in Alpine. So if someone is wanting to leave an unsafe situation, we pretty much have to uproot them from their life in Alpine County and put them in another county where there is safe and affordable housing available. So that's a factor that we see.
Thank you. That's excellent. Excellent.
Courtney, you're unmuted.
Hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Sorry, I'm in the back of the room helping somebody get some papers. So I was just gonna share that here in Mammoth Lakes in Meadow County, we kind of are facing the same situation, but there's a lot of people that buy these as their second home. So it makes it a little bit more difficult for people that live here to purchase homes, or you're constantly renting. And people are also doubling up a lot in housing. So that was all I wanted to share. Did anybody else in the room want to contribute?
Yeah, this is Tom Hodges. Just real quick. There.
Can you guys still hear us okay?
Perfect.
They can.
Okay.
Something.
We had a little glitch there.
Oh.
Real quick, yeah, I mean, just, I think that the affordability issue is accentuated in our community because, we have a ski resort here and
All right. You know what, because anybody in Jackson want to share with, we got Robin in the back. We'll see if we can unfreeze you. You froze on us. We're going to do Jackson now, and then if we can unfreeze you, we will.
So we were talking about Amador and Calaveras.
Amador and Calaveras.
Some of the things that have been mentioned, like living multifamily, living with relatives, and even the stress that involves. There's a 3-year wait for low-income apartments here in Amador. That often families will have to go pretty far out to find lower rents, and then transportation becomes a big issue. That bus transportation here is sometimes lacking. and to say the least. And safety is an issue because families end up in, a large family in a small trailer or something that's not safe, or up above a restaurant, and it's usually not long-term, so there's no stability. And then transition of certain places, like for example, a corporation that's buying a trailer park here in Amador, and
Same
that,
thing in.
things that are going to change with that.
Mhm.
And then the rural census tracts don't show us as low income because you might have a really expensive home in an area where there are low income. So for funding, that's an issue. And then folks that have no rental history or
Right,
credit. And then we talked about Airbnbs and temporarily living in motels.
Right.
So
Thank you. Excellent. All right, we're gonna. Okay.
The information that they shared is.
Now we can hear you, Courtney.
Just Mono County.
Yeah, no.
The rent is different,
We can hear
Yeah.
you now.
I was looking at that too, because I thought it was kind of interesting what they were saying was rent wise, because I pay.
All right, yeah, we're just gonna move, we'll keep moving on. Anybody else here? We got a hand over here. Sorry, Courtney, we were trying to unmute you, but we're gonna just do one more comment, I think.
Talking about the impact. Regina and I share similar jobs, but I'm in El Dorado and she's here in Amador. And talking about youth and families, that we're seeing more families in the shelters, but also the impact of education on the children. And that's something I think that is really not talked about as profoundly as the is playing out in society.
Exactly.
We see these generations beginning to not graduate and then perpetuating the cycle.
The homelessness, exactly, exactly. One more comment and then we'll move on because we want to get to Chris. This lady over here.
I was actually going to talk about with the education piece that we're starting to see families in our programs where we're having kids being reported into the SAR board and then now having to try to work with those young adults. And also we're starting to see an increase in mental health services as an impact to families that are living in homeless situations.
Exactly. That's it. And I'm glad you came up with those because that'll take me more quickly through my, I think this is frozen now too again. Okay. Click away. No, next one. Okay. So I just want to share with you, somebody mentioned Habitat for Humanity. They have a great, just so many resources. And they have a magazine and it's available online. It's the magazine for Habitat for Humanity. But I loved this quote. I saved it from September, where they talk about quality housing. Housing that is safe, healthy, and affordable is foundational to individuals and families, to the communities in which we live, and to the economies in which we all participate. And from what everybody said, you can hear that in your in the issues that you see. We talked about education. So child development and educational success, there's in that magazine, there's actually a study that they quote. It was the effect of stable housing on educational outcomes and childhood well-being. They followed 1,300 families who had moved into Habitat homes over the last 20 years. And this isn't a negative, but they put it in a positive, which is really better than what I did. They tracked the family's involvement and they found striking results, giving people housing, their math and reading proficiency increased for the kids. The absences decreased for the kids, and they had way less suspensions than their peers. So lots of hard information. Also, we talked about health. And again, your zip code determines how long you're going to live. And when you look at, there's this Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, you can put your zip code in, although I put in South Lake Tahoe, nothing came up, so that scared me. But typically you can put your zip code in and it will tell you about your, longevity estimations. And again, people use more emergency rooms. People don't have continuity of care. People with chronic health conditions that are using urgent care. And then, of course, the increasing stress and anxiety, which we see in the kids, we see in the parents. People are making these terrible choices, whether it's they're traveling more distances, all of the things that you talked about. And it's just toxic for all of us. But the other thing that I thought was really interesting in this Habitat magazine of September was they talked about the drag on the economy. And think about it, we have a very strong economy right now. We have very low unemployment. But they estimate that if you look at gross domestic product, that you would actually see, if we had more affordable housing and people were able to live in their communities, you could see GDP growth much higher than what you see right now. Right now, it's very, very lagging. It's slow. So this was productivity's lessened. People are traveling distances. Tax generation is lessened. So there's a lot of things that drag on the economy. And then just thinking of people who can't stay in your communities, that have to leave your community entirely, young people who can't afford, et cetera, et cetera. And then I just want to share one last piece with you. Nevada County mentioned Corporation for Supportive Housing. How many folks are familiar with them? Just give me a little show of hands. CSH. Okay, so they're an excellent, excellent resource, and they have a lot of materials directed to specific populations. So I did send out to everyone who registered an email with information about a one roof project, which is specifically targeting child welfare involved families. It's very, very interesting. I will resend all this to everyone again, but they actually have a great project where they help you look at the 8 steps to helping families achieve self-sufficiency. So that's something to just take a look at for those child welfare involved families. But also CHS works with the state of California Housing and Community Development Program. And they are one of 3 providers that provide technical assistance to counties in the state of California. And if you go to this website, it talks about the different types of technical assistance that's available. And it also talks about on this website funding that's available. So I wanted to make sure that at least you had that information. I sent it out and I will send it again with you know, our highlights and resources, but it's in your packet as handout number 7. But you can't click it from a piece of paper, so that's why I want to resend it to you, okay? So that you have a clickable links that you can utilize. All right, with that, I am going to introduce Chris Martin because it's your turn. Chris, would you come on up? Chris is going to talk to us about how we got to where we're at and what are some of the resources where we can improve services. All right, I'm going to give you this.
Probably not.
This is not, yeah, this is nice. There you go. And then remember your delay. Thank you.
Let's see here. While I'm doing this, I would just highlight the TA that's available because that came from HCD went through, you know, hell and high water to make that happen. And so that TA is really helpful in the organizations that they chose. There's a housing first component and a variety of things in there that are extremely helpful. So I want to highlight that because it's only going to be available for a short amount of time, but it is a resource to local jurisdictions. So I would just highlight that. There we go. All right. Great. Thanks everyone for having me here today. Again, my name is Chris Martin. I always love to make the reference that I am not the lead singer of Coldplay. It's actually right. So I have a state senator who loves to make that point every time I'm testifying. He's asked me to sing a song to the Senate. It's been a blast being named Chris Martin. But so I work at Housing California. We're an advocacy nonprofit that's focused on uniquely on both housing and homelessness. There's a lot of housing organizations out there. There's a lot of homelessness organizations out there. We actually combine the two, and I believe are one of the few, if not one of only a handful in the entire country that focus on both topic areas very intently. So we have two lobbyists. So myself, I focus on our homelessness work, although my colleague who handles our affordable housing and land use work left in the spring. So naturally, I took everything at a perfect time when it wasn't a top issue in California. So I've gotten to immerse myself in both topic areas, and so I'll be talking a lot about what's been going on here. So more to housing California. There we go. So if folks can see, obviously these are probably really small for the people in the room, but we helped lead the Prop 1 and 2 campaign there on the left, which in 2018 was a $6 billion combined, a $6 billion bond for affordable housing and supportive housing that I will talk about a little bit later. So we work on campaigns and electoral stuff. In the middle is the 2017 housing package signing ceremony. So of course, as I mentioned, we do legislative work as well. And then finally on the right is our Residents United Network. We have a organization or a project of Housing California called the Residents United Network, which is a group of over 100,000 people that are currently living in affordable housing that come to Sacramento. They organize locally and kind of advocate for other people to be able to benefit from the housing that they've been provided. So really powerful stuff and great stories, and we build power through that coalition. So today I'm going to kind of talk through the previous 86 years of housing history. I'll try and do that. I'm going to have to go through that kind of quickly. There's a lot to cover there, but then kind of walking through the history, obviously focusing on the rural aspect to this, and then looking at single family and multifamily and how that development has led to the crisis we're in today, as well as the recent lack of investment, and then shift over to kind of what's happening today and focus on the last 4 years, because there's enough stuff in the last 4 years to cover a 4-hour presentation. So there's certainly a lot of things that have happened recently, especially in the past couple months, that I will be highlighting. And feel free to stop me at any point. I have a knack for acronyming. The state loves to acronym every single thing we do. So there's going to be a bunch of acronyms, and hopefully I'll try not to do that, but feel free to stop me. And if you have questions throughout, feel free to stop me. So I'm going to start kind of in the more urban context and then shift over to rural. So how many folks in here are familiar with redlining? It's kind of a term that gets thrown out a lot. People talk about it. And it's a really interesting topic. It's something I heard at the National Alliance to End Homelessness Conference, where the author of The Color of Law, which is a really great book, talked about the history of housing policy in Richard Rothstein in the Nation, and it's pretty fascinating. I'd encourage you all to read it. It's a great book, and is far more detailed than what I'm about to present to you all. But really, through the Homeowners Loan Corporation, they put together these metropolitan areas, these maps of what were considered desirable places for investment. You can see on the right here, that's a map of San Francisco, and it's color coded based on quote unquote desirability. Of course, in a lot of these red areas, and that's why it's called redlining, these were termed as not desirable for investment, and so these were considered quote unquote hazardous areas. But they, after the HOLC or HOLC dissolved in the 50s, it was found that these areas were primarily based on race. And so because of that, because they were designated hazardous or redlined, that they had adverse effects for people being able to secure loans, and it impacted their credit scores, it impacted development, it impacted community development in those areas, and so had an adverse effect on the people in those areas. And to today, actually, there was a study that found that the 74% of neighborhoods that were graded high risk or hazardous today are low income neighborhoods still today. And so it kind of shows this disparity in resources, in that these areas were primarily areas of color, and so kind of created and contributed to the wealth gap and the challenges that we have primarily in urban areas today. I'll leave it there. There's a lot more to redlining than that, and it's contributed in a lot more factors, but it's kind of the 10,000 or 30,000 foot view of what happened there. So this is probably going to be really hard for you all to see in the room, but I'm going to walk through kind of these next few slides are rural context. And really to show you that this isn't, as everyone in this room knows, this isn't a urban problem, this isn't a suburban problem. This is a challenge that rural communities throughout our state and our country are facing today. So this is a map from the Housing and Community Development Department that walks through permitting in jurisdictions throughout our state. And as you can see, the red is the gap, and you can see the need there. The red is almost disproportionately in rural areas, and that this is a challenge that faced, you can see the Central Valley there, you can see Southern California in the rural areas. This isn't just an urban problem, and it's faced throughout our state. To that end, rural counties have the highest poverty rates in the state. And this map, the orange and red are the more higher poverty rates, and the blues are the lower poverty rates. And it's kind of fascinating to look at the coast and actually see lower poverty rates than you see here. And so, again, rural counties facing challenges as well. Of course, this next one's got specifics. There it is. So, oh, darn, there we go. And this is a cost burden. So in terms of how much folks are paying for rent and how that impacts your ability to pay rent, of course. And so a lot of these counties, much of these counties are rural counties. I believe that's Yuba County that is the most severe rent burden in the state. And so this isn't just, again, this isn't a San Francisco problem only. This is obviously facing rural counties throughout our state. All right, so talking about rural housing programs that have existed in the past, and then talk about a few that still exist today. Of course, there were quite a few programs back in the 70s and early 80s. And those programs on the top, the Indian Assistance Program, Pre-Development Loan Program, none of those exist today. And then shifting to the bottom half, the three that we mentioned, the Office of Migrant Services, and then the Joe Cerna Farm Worker Housing Program, that actually got funding recently. So that's a program that still is in action today. And then the California Self-Help Housing Program.
Are any of those programs that no longer exist being put into legislation to bring them back?
No. I think what the next slide will show you is kind of the context we're trying to get to today, which is to look at existing programs. I think the state is trying to get away from one-offs, so to say, where we create new side projects instead of doing rural set-asides, if that makes sense. So the self-help housing program is something that also got funding recently and is kind of I would say one of the more marquee programs in rural areas. On our board, we have the self-help housing organization that is one of our rural housing developers. And so that is a program that does get funding today. In terms of, there we go, in terms of the way we look at today. So certain programs in the state do have rural set-asides. So the first one is the low-income housing tax credit program. This is kind of the most subscribed program in state government for housing development. Almost if you're going to develop in California and throughout the country, you're going to have to get a tax credit, really to boost how you get started. It's kind of usually the first money in is getting that tax credit program allocation. So there's a 20% set aside within the low income housing tax credit for rural areas. The multifamily housing program, the MHP program, which is the largest housing program at the state. The bond that I mentioned earlier, the $6 billion bond, 1.5 billion of that went to the multifamily housing program. So kind of a significant program that we try to fund, in significant ways, but and those funds are being available right now. So that got funding in 2018. And then ASIC, the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. This is a program that's kind of a unique program. It looks at the cap and trade dollars and is something that is using cap and trade funding to fund this, what's called the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. And that does also have a set aside. So that's kind of the direction they've gone more recently, is taking bigger programs, big investments, and then set asides within them. So obstacles to rural housing development. Of course, the federal budget, especially more recently, has gotten quite significant cuts in terms of how much development dollars are out there and what's available, especially for rural communities. There hasn't been new funding into a lot of the programs we just talked about for quite some time. Of course, there's a challenge with infrastructure in rural areas. And so that creates an added pressure and added challenge. There's a lack of, I would highlight the capacity in local jurisdictions to bring in developers. There just isn't a ton of developers that exist in rural areas. Really a challenge to even if you have the money, to utilize that money, and that we hear that throughout the state. And there's a lack of workforce, because we've got only so many people available to build these homes too. So, and that's a problem that exists throughout the state. So this slide, when I found this graphic, it was quite frightening to me, because I'm still somewhat new to the housing and homelessness world. And when I saw this graphic, I kind of took my breath away in realizing that in 1956, we developed twice as many homes as we did in 2018. And there is that perception out there that a lot of money is being infused into housing and homelessness, but yet it's still nowhere near the amount of money that we have historically. So that's the first thing I would point out with this slide, is if you look at just how development and permitting has gone over the past, this goes back to 1954 and goes up through 2016, just the drastic difference from even the 50s to today. And that, of course, just the sheer quantity of development has decreased. But then the second piece is to look at, the blue is single family homes, and then the green is multifamily. So you can see that the single family has stayed, relatively consistent, whereas the multifamily has drastically gone up and down over the years. Till today, where you see about 50-50 split in single family versus multifamily, whereas historically it hasn't been that way. As you can see in the early 2000s, it was primarily single family homes, which, for folks, when you fly into Los Angeles, I like to point out that Los Angeles County is primarily single family homes outside of the city of Los Angeles. And so when you fly in, just take a look and you'll just see the sprawl of single family homes and the lack of density there. And that is indicative of the crisis we have, because you can only build out so far. You have to start building up at a certain point. So that's the first thing I'll point out in terms of construction. So within the multifamily piece, so you've got the top here on this graphic is that we have a need of over 100,000 units of multifamily development every year. That's been consistent, right? And then when you look underneath here, the green is the overall what we've actually built. And I'm sure this is probably hard for everybody to see. But then below that is the amount of those multifamilies that's actually affordable. So not only are we not meeting our multifamily goal, we're not even getting close to our affordable goal within that multifamily, those multifamily units. So kind of, not only are we not meeting that goal, we're also not making affordable multifamily units. So kind of compounding that crisis. And that's over the past 10 years, that graphic. This is over the last 17 years, and this is the same. This is just an expanded version of the graphic from earlier, from the 1950s till today. And it really points out our projected housing need, which is about 180,000 homes annually, and where we're at today, and just the drastic difference in, you can see how we just dipped pretty significantly in about right up to 2007, 2008. And then with the loss of redevelopment, which I'll talk about in a second, contributed to this challenge. So of course, all these graphics are really showing kind of where we're not anywhere near meeting our need for housing throughout the state. This graphic is really getting at two different pieces. The graphic on the left side here is showing the amount of renter households broken down by income. So the blue is extremely low income and the green is low income. And then on the right is how many affordable rental homes there are. And so really just showing the drastic gap here that we have only about 1/3 of the need in terms of actual homes that are available to those individuals. So nowhere near the need. But then on the right side here, this is looking at our the production and the need versus market versus low income. And you can see on the right is the market side. We have a huge market rate need, and we're not yet meeting that, but we're closer to meeting that. And then if you look on the left is the low income need, and we're not even, there's like barely a blip for the blue is the actual production. So we're not even close to meeting that need. So of course we have a huge need in market rate, but really the priority should be on low income individuals because that is where the crisis is most acute. All right, and this is a slide that I feel pretty passionate about, but not everyone loves to hear this. And this is what our state spends in terms of home ownership versus renters. And this is quite the misconception here, because in the public you'll hear about, recently the governor putting, $500 million into the low-income housing tax credit program. Sounds like a lot, right? But then when you look at the left here, and this is spending per household. On the left, you have the real property tax deduction, which a tax deduction, I like to point out, is really just an expenditure from the state. We're spending money on that tax deduction. And then the second piece, the darker blue, is the one that everyone loves, the mortgage interest tax deduction, which federally is about $55 billion a year. So I heard Nan Roman with the National Alliance to End Homeless made this comment recently, which was to end homelessness, she believes is about $11 billion annual need, and that if you eliminate the mortgage interest tax deduction, it's $55 billion. So just to put things in perspective of how you could actually end homelessness by prioritizing that population. And then you look on the right here, the red is what we're spending on renters in our state, and the stat, the stat she referenced was it's a little over $10.5–11 billion is an estimate to end homelessness, which is really, I think they calculate that using the housing choice voucher and then providing that to every single person in the country, and that would cost about $11 billion annually. And then putting that in comparison to what the state spends, she actually put two references. One was to buy and operate one aircraft carrier is $30 billion annually. And the mortgage interest tax deduction is over $50 billion annually. So it's really about priorities.
So is that cost specifically for the vouchers or actually for the housing that it would entail to make that happen?
Right.
Because a voucher is one thing, somewhere to spend it is something different.
Yeah, and we will talk about that topic in a little bit, but yeah, it's specific to the voucher, and that's why I'd like to put an asterisk in there, is it would probably cost much more than $10 billion, but you would need the housing to provide that voucher for.
At the risk of taking us down a different road, but also just to clarify, that feels like it might be putting a simplistic answer, because the reality is even with housing and even with vouchers, the willingness to accept those vouchers on behalf of the ownership is a whole nother issue within the
Which
experience.
we had a bill last year, I'll walk through in a second, which is exactly getting at that problem. So again, just highlighting here the disproportionate amount of spending, and this is at the state level, that we spend about $864 per household in those home ownership programs. And then for renters, we're spending, I believe it's $64 per renter. So drastic difference in what our state is spending. It's about 13 times greater on home ownership versus renters. Alrighty, so in talking about redevelopment, how many folks remember redevelopment? So while it's not a perfect system, it did have significant amount of funding for housing included in redevelopment. With the loss of redevelopment in I believe it was 2012, and then 2013 was the first year without it, you can see the drastic difference in spending and how that contributed to homelessness, and how by drastically dropping how much we're spending, I wonder what that amount is, $110,000. Yeah, it's just fascinating looking at 13 and 14, and then how that contributed to homelessness, and how by us disinvesting in housing and eliminating our resources for housing production, you see a drastic increase in homelessness, because homelessness is a result of housing affordability. And we see that throughout the state. So this is really just getting at how by investing in something, you can solve it, right? So by eliminating redevelopment, we saw drastic increases in homelessness. And then finally, in terms of obviously a lot of statistics in here, but this is the out of reach report, which I believe you have the state snapshot in your folder, 8A. And this is this is a report that the National Low Income Housing Coalition does every single year. They look at congressional districts, they look at counties throughout the country. And the overarching thing that I'll say is there's not a county in the entire United States where a minimum wage job can pay for a 2-bedroom apartment. Not a single county in the entire United States of America. And then this breaks it down based on like what the average renter wage is here in California, which I believe is like $22 or so. Our minimum wage is $12. And then the necessary wage for housing was, I think, $34. Did I get that right? So that should be on there, which really just gets at, how, everyone knows this, but how expensive housing here is in California. And that's throughout the state, right? So I think Barbara broke it down by some counties.
Handout 8, I sort of just took some of the information from the full report, and I tried to compare our counties to California, just so you could see how we look. But it's only, I just kind of picked different statistics. But you had the full report emailed, and I will email it again to you. Okay.
And California, we love to lead in everything. So we lead in housing unaffordability. We're number 2 in the country. I forget who number 1 is, but we'll have to find out so we can top them. You might be right. I think it is Hawaii. So yeah, and this is a really cool map. I linked to it in the PowerPoint slides, but you can find it online. And you can play with it. It's really cool. You can like compare different counties or different congressional districts and different states and just see how much you would have to work to pay for a 2-bedroom apartment. I believe this is 91 hours that you would have to work in a week to pay for a housing unit here in California on average. So obviously, I don't want to work 91 hours. So yeah, kind of crazy. So it's really interesting to look at, and I'd encourage you all to check it out. And then the California Housing Partnership Corporation also does data very similar to this, specific to California. That's where a lot of those slides came from, was California Housing Partnership does a lot of data. They have a huge data team, and they're focused specifically on California. So I would encourage you to check out their report. They release one also annually that talks about California counties, and theirs is broken down by counties in the entire state. So pretty frightening to see. Before I move to policies, is there any overarching questions with that kind of first half? Anything online? This is my bread and butter, this second half here. Nothing? Okay. This is a lot. So again, this is where the acronyms are going to come in. And this is where I'll probably end up talking really fast. So feel free to stop me because there is a lot to cover that has happened over the past 4 years. As I mentioned on the slide earlier, that was the signing ceremony for the 2017 housing package, which was the largest package of housing bills ever passed in California history. This was second to last year of Jerry Brown's tenure as governor. And I like to joke that I got my offer letter for Housing California the day the package was announced. So I'm solely responsible for this package getting passed. Yeah, it's completely all me. So included, I'll highlight a few bills within this package and one that wasn't necessarily included in the package. The first is SB2. So is anybody familiar with SB2 already, the Building Homes and Jobs Act? So this is was the most controversial bill in the package and the hardest one to get passed. Us as lobbyists, we're up. It's kind of fun. It's like watching a basketball or football game. We were up late at night. It was like 11:30. And it was real, kind of tense throughout the process. But they ended up getting the votes for this bill because it's a 2/3 bill. This is a fee on real estate transactions up to $225. And this creates an ongoing revenue source for local jurisdictions to use for housing, homelessness, for a variety of uses. It's about statewide, it's about $250 million each year. And again, as I mentioned, that doesn't go to the state. That money doesn't come to the state. It does, a small portion of it does, but the vast majority of it goes through the CDBG formula, which is the Community Development Block Grant formula, to local jurisdictions to be used. One nuance to that I'll mention on the next slide in more detail is the first year of funding had to be used for, part of it was used for local planning, and then the other half was used for homelessness, and that was very broad. And I'll talk about how that funding got used in a moment. So the other piece was SB3. This was the bond. This was what placed the Proposition 1 specifically on the ballot, which was a $4 billion bond. $3 billion went to what I would call affordable housing generally. $1 billion went to what's called the CalVet Home Loan Program, which is a loan program for veterans, of course, that gets repaid because it's a loan program. So that money comes back to the state. That and 1.5 of the 3 went to that multifamily housing program, which does have a rural set aside within it. The other 2 that were included in the package was AB 1505, which made it repealed a law that outlawed inclusionary zoning. And so this bill repealed that law so that local jurisdictions could include local inclusionary zoning policies. And so since that bill passed, we have seen some policies been enacted, but not a ton. But it just allowed for it. It didn't mandate it. Inclusionary zoning just means like inclusion of affordable within projects. So like saying that if you're going to build a certain project, that a certain percentage has to be restricted to a AMI, like 30% AMI, 50% AMI, just kind of including people that are low income in the overall project. Does that make sense? That's kind of a very high level view of that, but yeah.
And didn't is that the one where some cities are suing the state, like Orange County, or is that something else? I don't want to.
That's more related to housing element in RENA, but the state's suing them, and then they're suing back. It's like this whole thing. We're actually a plaintiff in one of them, but and then the other bill was SB 35. This is something that we'll probably talk about quite a few times over the next few slides. This concept, which is streamlining, so trying to expedite the process for permitting and developing. And so this bill is really looking at streamlining processes, and so that was included in the package. There were, I think, 11 other bills, but I'm not really going to highlight a lot of those. And there is a link. If folks are really that interested, I am happy to forward you a link that is really helpful that Cap Radio did that kind of separates what each does. The other bill that I selfishly have to mention that happened in 2017 related to housing and homelessness, this was my first actual bill that I worked on, and this was not necessarily included in the package of bills, but it did happen that year. And that's AB 74, which looks at our chronically homeless population. And there's a federal program called the National Housing Trust Fund, which comes to states, and the state of California gets a significant amount of money from that. And what this bill would do is use those 3 years of that allocation to be used for development of permanent supportive housing, to be used for chronically homeless individuals. This has a rigorous tracking component to it. It has tracking regarding Medi-Cal outcomes for these individuals, because they have to be chronically homeless and they have to be Medi-Cal beneficiaries, which is pretty much one and the same. And so this is really looking at providing supportive housing for those individuals. We're in the second year of the 3 years of the National Housing Trust Fund at the current moment. And there's another component to this program, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But it's a really important bill and a program that the state really actually likes because of that tracking and outcomes that's included in it. And it's looking at kind of like a cost saver, because a lot of people are chronically homeless are using public hospitals and services, and by getting them into housing, we're drawing down those costs and actually saving the state and locals money. Almost there. I can see the clouds. All right. So as I mentioned, the SB2 funds, the first year had to be used. Some of it had to be used for homelessness. So what they did was part of the 125 had to be used. 125 million had to be used in first year of SB1 or SB2, and 57 of that 125 got used on the Housing for Healthy California program for a different type of permanent supportive housing, because you don't have to do permanent supportive housing through development only. You can do PSH through rental assistance with wraparound services. And so the 57 million that came in through SB2 got used for the rental assistance component, and that's going to counties, and it's a competitive program. So that's a different piece of it, but that was included in the budget cycle that I'm about to talk about. So in 2018, this was Jerry Brown's final year. And in that final year, there was a lot of momentum around homelessness specifically. And the big city mayors came out and were asking for, I think it was $1.5 billion. And it was an interesting year. And what ended up coming out of that year was what's called the Homeless Emergency Aid Program. This is HEAP. And this program is for continuums of care and for the big 13, or big, at that time it was the big 11 cities. And it's really a broad program that can be used for emergency assistance for people experiencing homelessness. It was very broad and could be used for anything and didn't really have strong tracking to it. But that program had a really tight expenditure period and actually has to be spent by today, this is 2020 now, so 2021, end of next budget cycle. So really tight time period for spending that money. Also included in this budget year, I mean, overarchingly, it was over $700 million to address homelessness through a variety of other programs, some existing, some not. The California Emergency Solutions and Housing Program, that's for people experiencing homelessness as well. That's the ESG program, if folks know that. The Emergency Solutions Grant Program was converted into this California Emergency Solutions and Housing Program. A lot of things in this budget. $50 million for the Adult Reentry Grant Program, which I'm on the steering committee for, allocating those dollars, which is like rental assistance and warm handoff services for people exiting prison. So a lot happened in 2018. Am I doing all right on time? Okay, I'll go quick. In terms of legislation from 2018, two things happened. One was the Homeless Youth Act. This was a bill that I was really proud to be sponsoring, which originally would have created a grant program specific to homeless youth within our state. We don't really have a program for homeless youth in California. And the feds, they really just have the youth demonstration program, which is only to certain jurisdictions. So youth really miss out on homelessness programming and are not necessarily competitive in the coordinated entry system. So we were trying to focus our efforts on youth. This bill got amended because we didn't get funding in the budget, and really just put some goals and priorities for the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council at the state level to start tracking and putting together a plan to address youth homelessness. The second bill, kind of getting at that streamlining thing I mentioned earlier, this was AB 2162, which makes supportive housing right. And so that kind of, and it has tight timelines in terms of review processes and making sure it meets specific standards, but really trying to expedite the process of permitting and moving forward with development of supportive housing. Both of those bills were signed. So 2019, last year, we have a new governor who made his priority housing and homelessness throughout his entire campaign. And so what happened, I'm not going to walk through the semantics of how we got to this point, but he did end up in his budget with $2.7 billion to address both housing and homelessness. So on the housing side of things, went to 3 different programs. Mentioned earlier the state low-income housing tax credit program, which is pretty large on top of the federal one I've also mentioned. And this is the state low-income housing tax credit program, and he added an additional $500 million into that program. He added $500 million into the mixed income loan program, which just by the name kind of is self-explanatory, but it really looks at developments that are more moderate income and not necessarily low income, but it's really mixed in the trying to bring in integrated developments of both types of income levels. The final is the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program, or IIG, and this is a program that looks at all the infrastructure that has to come with housing. So sidewalks, streets, things like that that come around the development, and trying to spur that as well. On the homelessness side of things, we got $650 million. The previous year it was HEAP, then last year it was HAP. So this was the Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention Program. And I actually think it's HAPAPA, but it's HAP, 650 million, and this goes to counties, continuums of care, and cities throughout our state. The application is due in 2 days, so if anybody's working on that, hopefully it's going in soon, because I just heard from them yesterday that they didn't get a lot of applications, so a little concerned. But that's 650 million. It's a more rigorous application process, this one, and it's starting to get to a point like HEAP was meant to be emergency, HAP was meant to be middle term, kind of a little bit more long-term thinking. And what I will say is what's going to probably happen this year is going to be a much more long-term vision for how the state addresses homelessness. And if folks do have questions about that, I probably don't have time to talk about it, but there's a lot happening this year. So there was a policy in the budget, again, getting at streamlining and by right. We like to do trailer bill language in the state and hide policies that aren't necessarily as popular through what's called trailer bill. There's a really good article about that by Assemblymember Mainshine about how that's very non-transparent, but by right approval of navigation centers. So a navigation center is like an enhanced shelter, kind of started in San Francisco, but now the state's starting to look at this. And this would require the by right approval of low barrier navigation centers. And so this starting to look at kind of a best practice around sheltering individuals. And this would require by right approval of those types of shelters. Real small legislative year too. So in terms of legislation from last year, the one that I'll start with is one that has been something advocates have been working on for decades, which is AB 1482. And this is the rent gouging bill. And this really was something the governor took on and started supporting. And this bill would limit rent increases to 5% plus the consumer price index, which ends up being about varying in jurisdictions between 8 and 12% overall. And this is restricted to rental housing and restricted to, more large owners of housing. So if it's a single family home and you're just renting out to somebody and you just own that one home, or it's a 2 and less, then it wouldn't apply. So like my rental housing doesn't apply to this. It's only owned by corporations, large, huge corporations that own these units. So that's the rent cap bill. But I would argue that more importantly within that bill was a clause around just cause eviction, which means that you can't just evict someone because you don't like them. You have to have a reason to evict somebody. And you can't really do a rent cap without just cause eviction, and you can't really do just cause eviction without a rent cap. Kind of nuanced, but because if you didn't have the just cause eviction, then you could just evict a person and then increase the rent on the next person. And if you did have just cause without the rent cap, then you could just increase rent astronomically to kick that person out. So really you have to have both to be comprehensive. This bill was pretty huge. It does have a sunset date. I think it's 2029, but a pretty huge bill. in terms of the rental market here in California. The next one I'll mention that I worked on was SB 329, which gets at housing choice vouchers. And this is looking at source of income discrimination and making it so that you can't discriminate against somebody just because they hold a housing choice voucher or a voucher generally. So if you're using rental assistance in the HEAT program or in the HAT program and somebody has a voucher because of that, you can't discriminate against them just because they have that voucher. This bill is pretty huge. I was really excited to be working on it. We actually, in Sacramento, there was some news recently about a bunch of landlords that are still discriminating, and the Fair Employment and Housing Department in the state is suing those landlords. So it's already being used here in February, in the second month of enactment. So pretty huge. And this really gets at when you see a listing on like Craigslist where it says no Section 8 allowed, that would be illegal. You can't do that anymore. You can still screen for creditworthiness. You can still screen for income. All the other pieces that you would typically look at for a renter, you can still look at those things and sort based on that, but you can't discriminate solely because somebody has a housing voucher. I'm going to probably skip the rest of those bills other than mention that parolees are now eligible for the Mental Health Services Act, which is pretty huge in terms of services for people that are exiting prison because they really have challenges finding mental health treatment and housing. I won't go down that path, but a lot there, and that was a pretty big bill too. So finally, I'm going to talk about this year and what's going on. Yeah.
Before, were parolees ineligible for mental health? Really? I didn't know that.
That was a carve out, yeah, in the original Prop 63. And so this bill was something, relates to another bill that I'm working on, which is about supportive housing for parolees with severe mental illness that are experiencing homelessness. And one of the problems was that the county that was trying to serve those individuals couldn't utilize MHSA for the non-federal share because they're Medi-Cal, under Medi-Cal, it's 50 to 90% reimbursement. And then the other piece, the county couldn't find the funds for. But now that MHSA is eligible for parolees, that kind of fills that gap, which is going to be really huge for parolees. All right, 2020, which is crazy. So the governor on January 8th announced an executive order relating to homelessness, pretty huge. The first was it didn't provide funding. There's a lot of misinformation out there. It didn't provide funding. It created the California Access to Housing and Services Fund, which is what I mentioned. You know, we had HEAP, then HAP. This year, whatever comes out is going to be the California Access to Housing and Services Fund, but what that looks like is kind of TBD. So really all it did was create the fund to be the money to go into it eventually, and doesn't have the parameters for what it is yet. Also included were a few other things. So a commission on the root causes of homelessness. So there's some new resources or researchers in the state. The California Policy Lab in Los Angeles, which is a fascinating thing because it's UCLA and USC working together. And it's a really cool resource called the Homeless Policy Research Institute. And they are going to be working with the Benioff Institute in San Francisco, which is another set of minds and great people like Margot Kuchel to work on studying the root causes, what causes people to fall into homelessness. It also created a behavioral health task force to look at the Mental Health Services Act and how that can be better utilized for people experiencing homelessness. And they actually have to provide recommendations by April, which is fascinating. Anybody that does anything about state government thinking that they're going to get a recommendation list in 3 months, good luck. Then tasked the Department of General Services to identify excess state land that can be used by local partners primarily for shelter for experiencing homelessness. It included state hospitals in this and some other pieces of state land. Notably provided 100 trailers. These are FEMA trailers that the state is now using and providing to local jurisdictions. They put out a request for folks to, or for RFA, if local jurisdictions want these trailers. I think they've already gone to Oakland and LA because those were, I think, the first 2 to come in. So then finally, a multi-agency state crisis response team. And this is all the state departments that will start to work together, hopefully, and provide some TA to local jurisdictions to assess how you can help people immediately get off the streets. And that's got a lot of state departments in it. So I think it's like 8 state departments. So in terms of budgetary outlook this year, there's been a lot of progress here. The governor's January budget, it's called his Jan 10 budget, provides over $1 billion this year to address homelessness. It's about 1.4 billion. 750 million he is proposing to go to that California Access to Housing and Services Fund. Probably don't have enough time to talk about what he's proposing that look like, but essentially he's proposing is anybody familiar with what's called a flexible housing subsidy pool? Is that too much acronym? It's something that started in Los Angeles, and it's a pool that provides rental assistance, landlord incentives, housing navigation, really anything it takes to get somebody into housing. And it's been really successful in Los Angeles. They found that for every $1 they spent on this pool, they saved $1.20 on these individuals by getting them into housing. So it's actually got really good, solid evidence base behind it. The governor has really taken that and has started to look to taking that to scale at the state. That's the kind of the reasoning behind this Access to Housing and Services Fund. But he's trying to go through what he's calling regional entities. They're going to break down the state in regions and then have one provider per region. I'm very skeptical that that's going to end up happening just because there's a lot of challenges with that, and we've built a system through HEAP and HAP, and hopefully we don't silo out from that. But pretty significant funding the governor is proposing to be used for this year, and I would anticipate that we might even get more than 750 million because this will have to go through the budget process this year, which ends in June/July. He also proposed almost 700 million going to the Medi-Cal Healthier California for All, which is our revamp of Medi-Cal in the state. And these is primarily for services. So things like housing navigation, case management, and housing-based services. And so that comes with the federal match as well. So pretty significant amount of money there. And then finally, this community care collaborative pilot, which is kind of a new thing that he's starting that I don't know a ton about, but it's going to grow to $350 million over 6 years. On the housing side of things, the main investment was in the low-income housing tax credit program, which was invested in last year. And this is continuing that momentum around that state low-income housing tax credit program at $500 million.
First thing I want to say is that Chris Martin from Coldplay has nothing on you as far as all of this information goes. So kudos.
He actually works on homelessness. It's kind of fascinating. If you Google Chris Martin homelessness, I was like, dang, I thought I'd be the only one to come up.
So we have one question about the landlords not being able to discriminate against. So she said, for example, they're no longer using no Section 8, but have raised their credit score requirements to a level that it's obstacle for many low-income folks. Any plans for addressing this?
There's been a lot of talk around in 2 different things with that I don't know if it's going to play out, but I have heard rumors about like a state credit report agency and a state background check agency, because there's a lot of challenges that come about. I know in terms of like the actual numbers being varying depending on who you're talking to. And so the state is considering, I've heard talks about it, but I don't know if it's gotten very far, but discussions around the state having just one centralized resource, as well as background checks. We've had, I've heard, varying degrees of authenticity with those background reports. And if one challenge comes up, if someone got pulled over once, then they'll send the background check agency will say, not a good candidate, and that person might not have, actually committed a crime. So there's been varying challenges with that, but I haven't heard too much momentum around that yet, but that is a huge challenge. I think she's got a question. I've only got one more slide, so.
So I had a question about opportunity zones and how, at the federal level, and I know that California and the feds aren't necessarily, working in tandem right now, but like that Pioneer in Amador County is considered an opportunity zone, and Alpine County is considered an opportunity. I didn't go through everybody, but I just happened to look at it real quickly. And how might that dovetail into some of these housing needs and resources. And then my other question, or maybe it's more of a comment, is we've been doing point in time surveys for a long time. And there's a lot of research into why people are homeless. So the fact that we're spending more money on finding out why people are homeless is actually kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah, so on the first piece, I'll admittedly say that opportunity zone is not my specialty. I know that was, created through the Tax Act under the federal government. That I'm just not super knowledgeable. I know that was under Jerry Brown that they started that work around opportunity zones and trying to make it so that there's more development in those areas and concentrating that, but I really don't have a ton of information on that. Second piece, yes. So the root causes piece of that is I've actually heard that it might not happen because there is a little hesitation about that because we have a ton of data. Namely, Los Angeles does an incredible job of like understanding how people fall into homelessness. I think they found last year it was like 74% of people that fell into homelessness was simply economic reasons. So we kind of know what's causing this, right? So yeah, I think it is a little bit mind-boggling, but and I don't know where the progress is on that because I have heard some pushback on it. So okay, all right, I'll try and do this real fast. On the housing piece, on the housing budget, there was the state tax credit program. There was also an indication in his budget release that he's interested. I got to caveat that with interested because it isn't official or isn't necessarily moving yet, but in creating a new agency for housing and homelessness. Because right now, the state has a housing and community development department, which is under the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, which is kind of a conglomerate agency. It's kind of big, includes horse racing. And so I think this is the scale of the problem. We need to actually address that by having a individual agency similar to the federal government where we have HUD. So that was an indication. So I think there's a lot of push for that and a lot of folks would really like to see that happen. Budget's going to continue. I'm working on a huge budget request for $2 billion right now as we speak with a variety of local jurisdictions, and it's actually gaining momentum. And so we'll see how this all plays out throughout the budget process this year. But it's really exciting, and it sounds like there's appetite at looking at ongoing. Final thing I'll mention, I'm just going to probably highlight two bills here, two or three. SB 50 was something that a lot of folks I'm sure have heard about this year. This was looking at density around transit. There's a bill that got the New York Times interested, and we've saw, the whole nation get interested in this bill. That bill died, but I can't imagine that bill's going away. It's going to be a discussion that sticks around for quite some time, which is looking at density around transit. I think we'd just like to make sure that the displacement concerns and affordability are considered within any kind of proposal around density. AB 1845 is a bill we're sponsoring. It would actually create an office to end homelessness at the state. So that's something we are pushing forward. And then the other two are AB 1907. This is a bill that gets at streamlining again. This is a CEQA exemption. So the California Environmental Quality Act is something that typically can be used to hinder the or stop a project or add cost to a project for moving forward. So we're looking at exempting affordable housing that is funded through three programs: the multifamily housing program, the home program, which is a federal program, and the CDBG program. So if it's affordable development funded through those programs, it would be exempt from CEQA under this legislation. It would also exempt all supportive housing from CEQA as well. So pretty big bill. It's gotten bipartisan support. So we're hopeful that that moves forward this year. And then AB 1905, this is the mortgage interest deduction bill, looks at eliminating the mortgage interest deduction that our state provides for people to purchase a second home. Shockingly enough, our state provides a mortgage interest tax deduction for people buying a second or vacation home. I would argue we have 151,000 people living on the streets. We should prioritize that population before we prioritize people purchasing their second home. And so by eliminating that second home deduction, it would create I think it's about $300 million every year in funding. And then also part of this bill, under the Trump tax cut bill that passed, the state or the federal side of things moved that mortgage interest deduction from $1 million down to $750,000 that you can deduct from. And so this would actually conform with federal law and bring the states also down to $750,000 on the primary home. So that's just conforming with federal law. And that would also add another $200 million. So this would be about a $500 million ongoing revenue source that's created by eliminating both of those. And it would be used to address homelessness throughout our state very broadly. This bill has been done before. It was in 2017. It was AB 71 at the time. We sponsored it, did not make it very far. And this bill will face a lot of pushback. And so we are prioritizing this one and are hopeful that it moves forward this year. But yeah, that's a pretty significant bill because we need ongoing resources to address this challenge. As folks know, one-time funding for homelessness, very hard to make work and very hard to have a significant impact when you don't have the future outlook of what you're going to be getting to address homelessness. And so we really need ongoing funding. So I'll probably just leave it there. Yeah.
One more question from Aurora Danita Packard. She wants to know, are there rural set-asides for all of new budget programs? With California Coalition for Youth, we're lobbying for a youth set-aside. But I brought up the need for a rural youth set-aside. 50% of chronically homeless individuals were once homeless youth, which is one root cause of homelessness.
So on the first piece, there is a rural set-aside within the low-income housing tax credit program. So that does have a set-aside. On the homelessness program, the one that the governor proposed, it would go to all regions through a formula. So every region would be able to get it. So there wouldn't necessarily be a need for a rural set-aside within that. On the youth piece, in the governor's trailer bill, which he released for his program, there is not a youth set-aside. There has been in HEAP and there was in HAP. I think it was 5% within HEAP and 7 or 8% within HAP. Our proposal, Housing California, we're working with a variety of folks. Our proposal has a 10% set aside for youth and a 25% set aside overall for a variety of populations that are underserved. I would notably mention survivors of domestic violence who are almost always forgotten in our homelessness programming, and people exiting prison. So we have a 25% set aside that's actually been agreed upon with, like LA County and some large jurisdictions throughout our state because they see the need there. So we've been advocating. I work with CCY pretty closely. So we were part of the coalition with the California Coalition for Youth advocating for that youth set aside. So as I mentioned earlier, we worked on the Homeless Youth Act, and that was with the California Coalition for Youth.
Thank you so much, Chris. So we are a little behind schedule. So Cheyenne is kind enough to say, if you want to grab snacks while she's speaking, quietly go. We do have heavy snacks now, so we have all morning, the rest of our morning. Thank you so much, Chris. I'm sorry that there's so much information. It's like killer.
It's a lot, sorry.
That was great. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
sure.
What do we have here? Mike.
Oh, you guys didn't want to hear me talk the rest of the day?
So Cheyenne Purrington is our new executive director of the Tahoe Coalition for the Homeless, as well as she is, I usually just leave that sitting. As well as having her own consulting company, has worked with a lot of counties on homeless issues and strategies. So she's going to share with us reflections from the field, try to take us from all that information to our question portion when we get to network. And as I say, help yourself to snacks. Same thing in the remote sites. We're not going to have a break, and you online people are there. You'll be doing whatever you need to do. Thank you, Cheyenne.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to apologize in advance. I usually project quite well. I played soccer for 17 years, but I am getting over a cold. So I know that I'm projecting to the online sites, but maybe not as well here. So be patient with me. I will try to do my best. So I'm going to shift gears from what I think was a very good high-level policy, sort of systems level, structural level discussion about what's going on. And I'm going to bring it down to the organizational agency level and what we can do within our programs and within our regions that feels a little bit more actionable and tangible. I have a lot of appreciation for the policymakers for listening, I think, quite well to the people doing this work, to be responsive in their funding. And I think that it's also really nice to be able to, on the operational level, take things back do what we can within our space and within our sphere of influence. So that's what I'm going to focus on. And I don't have slides because I find them distracting both for myself and for audience, but I always prepare speaking notes and I'm happy to share those. So most of what I'm going to share is in my notes and you'll have that. So my goal in general is to get us thinking about complex problems that we want to wrap our own heads around so that we can do some process engineering within our programs that will help us be better servants to the folks that we're trying to keep out of homelessness and get out of homelessness. A lot of my background has been really focused on economics. I studied economics with the goal of trying to understand poverty and homelessness. And in thinking about how do people become homeless and whether they're more individual, is that working?
Yes.
Okay. Whether they're more individual or systems issues. So I'm a series of ideas for you to think about and sort of walk you through my thinking about approaching the concepts that we all work on. And then I'm going to try and end with some really tangible fixes that you might be thinking about for your programs. Okay, and I really do apologize, I'm squeaky. So one of the questions that some of the questions I'm going to be talking about and some ideas I'm going to be, they're not necessarily answers to these questions, they're ways of thinking. I try to focus less on formal technical training. I see all of you as the experts in the work you do and good problem solvers. Sometimes we just need to get ourselves out of the rut of doing the work and thinking about the work is a luxury. So I'm inviting you to think with me about these. I don't have answers. I think I have some, but I'm not trying to preach any specific answers. I will say that in general, when I'm asked by counties or by organizations to help solve problems with them, the biggest thing I say is it takes all strategies. This is a complex problem. There is no silver bullet. You will not have a policy fix. As much as I believe in policy, it's not more housing. It's all of the things, right? It's healthcare, it's income, it's all these things. So some of the questions I'm going to try and talk through are, what is homelessness? I know that seems really basic. What are the causes? Also seems kind of basic. How do we treat it? If there's a cause, there's the effects and then what we do to be responsive. And then how do we prevent it? Because that's really the goal. The way that we end homelessness is not to end homelessness, it's to end the preconditions of homelessness. So idea number one, thinking about what is homelessness. It's really simple to say it's the lack of housing. And the solution is get people housing and get them into housing. If you're doing this work, you know that it's not that simple. It's often much more complicated and takes many more resources than just the housing, right? It's the services, it's the support, it's the community connections and trauma, because that is something that we know increasingly is one of the threads that if we pull, that's common for most people experiencing homelessness. There's a development economist, Amartya Sen, and he looks at developing countries. And his focus was really trying to figure out beyond resources, how can we understand poverty and what to do about it? And he comes up with this idea around capabilities. And the idea is, instead of just thinking about the resources, it's what you do with those resources. It's what you can make from what you have. And it's a way of describing in developing countries when people may not have literal resources like money, but it applies to a segment of our population who fall within that sort of high level poverty. So people have many more resources beyond money and assets. There's all these non-monetary resources, social connections, access to policy influence, all of these things that we can think of. And so those are all these capabilities. Of course, resources help us create those capabilities. So if we have housing, we can also do things like lock our personal belongings up. We can have a mailing address. We can, have neighbors. We have stability. We have the ability to vote because they can send us our voter card. We can clean ourselves. We can get ready for a job. We can do all these things, right? So there's this significant thing around housing, which is, it is not just housing. It is this huge bundle of capabilities that when we lose it, it functions like a cliff. And you've all seen that. It is a drop. And it is like a cliff, so much harder to get back up and out of. And so when we start thinking about what does it look like to think of homelessness as this huge drop in the ability to manage resources and turn them into capabilities, and then how we bring those capabilities back into someone's life, it's a really significant way of shifting our language about both resources and options, because often we, even in the work, and I'm certainly guilty of this, we make some biased assumptions about why people become homeless, and that it was a series of personal failings or bad decisions. And that's hard to acknowledge, that we, even in the work, sometimes approach people that way. But actually what you look at is that it's usually a series of systems failings, like redlining, right? Like low income jobs. And it's these policy dysfunctions or these, system dysfunctions. And when people are vulnerable, they are more vulnerable to systems that are dysfunctional, and they're also more reliant on them. If you're a veteran, you're more reliant on the VA. If you're incarcerated, you're more reliant on a system. So again, this isn't an answer, it's just a way of framing our thinking about why is this problem so problematic? Why is it so complex? And it gets us thinking about these root causes. So the second thing I'm going to talk about is challenging our assumptions, even in the work, about what are the causes of homelessness. You'll see on the PIT, someone mentioned the PIT counts, and I'm very familiar with those. I think they're really good. If you haven't been on a count, you should go, and then you should look at the data both for past years and the most recent year. A lot of times you'll see big fluctuations in the numbers. That's not because the numbers actually went up or down. It's because the counting methods changed and we got better, or hopefully not worse, but better at counting people and bringing people into the system so that we can get funding. So some of the traditional causes, and you're all familiar with these, are loss of a job or income, loss of stable housing, loss of a significant relationship, change in relationship status, intimate partner or family abuse, alcohol and other substance use, and mental health conditions. Those are sort of the ones that you see on PIT counts, and they're often described. So then what we've done traditionally is to treat those. If we're thinking like clinically, we sort of say, okay, that's the problem, we're going to solve for that. And so we do things like job training, housing counseling, grief counseling, relationship counseling, right? You're all familiar with these. It's not that those aren't useful, but those are not the true underlying causes. Because for many of us, and I say us because I think it's helpful to think about it in a personal sense, the loss of a job wouldn't cause us to be homeless. The ending of a relationship wouldn't cause us to be homeless, right? So that's actually not what's happening, right? Those are maybe like triggers, and there may be that, nudge off the cliff, but we actually have to look further upstream and figure out what's going on. And I will challenge us to think about a term that I use, which is called social vulnerability, because it is essentially the precondition for someone who experiences one of these changes, these big life changes, that does that sort of cliff nudge. And it's that social vulnerability that we in the work need to get better at predicting and seeing. So it's quite easy to see homelessness in some ways. The best case is that we see it, because we don't actually want, especially youth and families are quite good at, it's a coping strategy to hide homelessness, because there's both stigma there and there's also self-preservation, right? You don't want to have your kids taken away. So there's a sort of lack of reaching out for resources for fear of the system itself. So the best homelessness to solve is the visible homelessness, right? And it's the thing we're all talking about in California. But actually, the harder homelessness to see is before it becomes homeless, right? So what does that precondition look like? It's housing insecurity, right? And there's all these sort of signs and symptoms we can look for when we look upstream and try to identify what does that look like? And thinking about youth and families, a lot of times it looks like a child is coming to school in the same clothes. The family seems to be living in their van and they're dropping the kids off. There's all these sort of preconditions, they're not attending the same school consistently. And those can be very hard to see, either because people aren't looking for it, they don't know what to look for, or they don't feel like they know what to do about it, right? Those are sort of the citizen social workers. They see something, but they don't know what to say, they don't know what they're seeing. And so there's something about our ability regionally and across systems to be sensitive to and responsive to what housing insecurity looks like, right? We're quite good at when someone comes in and says, I'm homeless, they're self-identifying as homeless. It's easier to solve that problem in some ways, but it's much more expensive. And we're doing this heavy lift to get them back up from that cliff, right? All of the dollars we want to be spending are on that prevention work and getting people less socially vulnerable and less housing insecure, right? And of course, people will still become homeless. It's going to happen. I don't think we can end homelessness as we think of it, but functionally, we can actually prevent a lot of it, especially for families and youth. So in some ways, all of the sort of traditional causes that I mentioned, whether you think of them as these, you know, sort of different types of causes, the threads in them that are true are often it's a life change and there's some traumatic response to it, the inability to respond to life changes with resilience, and then very quickly a heavy dependence on dysfunctional systems, right? All of a sudden now you're in a shelter. Now you're dependent on, you know, a program. You're sort of shepherded through a bunch of paperwork. So there's this experience, thinking about the client experience coming into homelessness, it's a drop off of options, of access. You suddenly are sort of dependent on systems that aren't working great. And I always think of the DMV as like my favorite example of a dysfunctional system that we all have to interact with. And I can't personally stand the DMV, it like makes you crazy. That is the experience for many people, many of our clients. It drives you nuts. Dealing with bureaucracies they're not designed around people, they're not human-centered. They are designed to do one thing in a mediocre way because you have to interact with them. I can't go somewhere else to get my, you know, I have to go to the DMV. So thinking about change, what life changes trigger that sort of cliff nudge, but what's happening upstream before that. And I appreciate you walking through this because I am going to land with some really tangible actions, but I want to frame how to think about these things because in this work, I find that people, even who have done it for years, struggle to explain it, struggle to understand it, struggle to feel responsive and empowered. And I do the same. I'm always questioning myself and sort of rethinking things that I thought I knew. And then I see something different. I go, huh, it's actually not quite like how I thought. So thinking about social vulnerability, and all of you probably are serving people who we would sort of acknowledge as socially vulnerable, but what does that mean? It is not one thing. It is it's this bundle of vulnerabilities, right? It may be that someone's low income, they're in housing where they're not on the lease, they come from you know, a challenged background of violence and trauma. They are disconnected because they moved recently to the area, so they don't know many people. It's all of these factors, right? And it's different for everybody, but we know them when we see them. We know that someone who's chronically homeless, we would look at them and say, that's someone who's socially vulnerable. A senior who's living alone and is on, you know, limited income at a mobile home park, probably socially vulnerable. Someone in a wheelchair, we kind of know it when we see it. And it's never just one thing, right? We kind of know that intuitively. It's this bundle of vulnerabilities. So looking for people who we know we are either already serving, but what is it about them and how can we understand their vulnerability? That, I would challenge us, is actually the precondition for housing insecurity. Less able to navigate systems, less resilient to change, less connected to resources, right? Those are the sort of significant implications for vulnerability. They also vulnerable people tend to be connected to other vulnerable people. So not only are they experiencing their own life changes, they're being responsive to other people's life changes and their resource drains. So you'll find that teen children are taking care of younger children. They are caretakers. These all become the sort of preconditions both for child abuse. So over occupancy, when you see families doubled up, when you see people sharing beds, those are all significant factors for what may lead to conditions of abuse. If we look sort of upstream, we can see those coming, right? We can see, you know, 7 people living in a 1-bedroom is not going to be a good environment for children. You know, a 13-year-old taking care of 3 little ones at home is not going to help them succeed. There's going to be challenges in that family. So what we can do is sort of be more sensitive to and responsive to, right? Sort of sensitive meaning we can see it better and we can respond to it better. Those two things, we can build better policies and practices into our programs that, separate from the state level funding, we can actually build better programs to do this work in different ways that sort of open ourselves to what vulnerability looks like, see it better for ourselves, work with our partners better, and design systems that actually work for people who are vulnerable instead of being dysfunctional. Am I following so far? I'm not like super off course? Okay. All right. So then I want to talk briefly about thinking about the system of homelessness, because often, like I mentioned, we kind of talk about homelessness. We don't tend to talk about people who aren't homeless but could be, right? So that precondition, which I call either housing insecurity or housing instability. And it is good to start thinking about those in your programs, because if you can have programs designed for both, because you want to be responsive to people who are literally street homeless or sheltered homeless, but maybe at risk. But you also want to figure out, well, how can we find who's becoming homeless before they're homeless? That's ideal. And often those are kind of known sources. So some terms to think about is, if we think about homelessness as a pool, there's inflow and then there's outflow. There's people getting housed, but there's still people becoming homeless, right? So you want to be thinking, we always focus, I think, a little bit too much on housing resources, right? And I'm not saying it's not important, but if we can also focus on inflow, preventing inflow while we're doing homeless, interventions, thinking about what it looks like. When people become homeless, they're actually quite easy to find beforehand. They live in housing, usually on the private market, or they're in sort of what I call informal affordable housing, like a mobile home park. They had an RV, but it got towed. They're in these marginal settings. But if you all think of where you live and where vulnerable people are sort of housing insecure, I know where they live in my neighborhood. They're in RVs. They're in the apartment building that's run sort of like a slum, slums conditions. They are staying in the shelter occasionally. Like, I would know where to find people who are housing insecure. And those are usually, they're either exiting from systems, like was mentioned before. They're in incarcerated systems. They're coming out of CPS. They're coming out of, different institutional settings. They just graduated, but now they can't stay because they'd have to be on the lease and they're going to be over occupancy. There's some situations. So now you're 18, you don't have a job, and you don't have housing either because you can't stay with your family. Well, that's a really significant thing that we could have seen coming. If every student graduating has a housing plan, right? If every student coming to us from foster care has 3 backup plans for housing that don't look like bad shelter situations, we can do a lot of prevention, a lot of trauma prevention. So thinking about inflow, people tend to be coming from private markets, so private landlords and institutions. So our programs need to be better at partnering with those entities. So what does it look like to reach out to your local institutions and do reentry or warm handoff programming? And what does it look like to partner with private landlords to have better sort of relationships with your landlords? You tend to know who owns, like, it's usually one or two people who own most of the low-income housing in a small region, right? They own like 3 apartment buildings in the area. You know them, and those are the best. You work with 1 or 2 landlords, and you've got maybe 70 people covered. And if they get a non-payment of rent notice and you get notification and someone's signing off, you can know in advance, months before someone's about to become homeless. Little system fixes are, I think, going to be more significant in rural areas than the big structural stuff that feels frustrating. So a few more things, and then I'll kind of move to some last ideas that are very actionable to kind of get us thinking about this. But one is just like, what does it look like for your programs to be better at detecting housing insecurity? Like, what would you need to do with within your organization or with your partners to be more aware? It could include looking at schools, how are teachers trained to see those signs? I call them, informal or citizen social workers. Sometimes it's the mailman, the garbage man, the public works companies. It could be, it really is whoever has eyes open, giving them tools to see it and then knowing what to do about it, right? Sensitive and responsive. And I think that is a way that we can have a more 360 view of who in our communities is becoming vulnerable or is vulnerable, and then responding with good resources. We often have good programs available and resources available. Not everyone who needs them is coming to us, so that's one piece. And of course, we still need, on the outflow side, we still need more housing resources. I'm not saying that's not critical. But I will say that there is this, because of this cliff effect, the timing really matters. And you've all heard of rapid rehousing. There is, especially for families, the longer you are homeless, even by a matter of days, the more trauma and the more exposure and the more likelihood for long-term homelessness or recurring periods of homelessness. So that's why seeing it early really matters, because it's a cliff, but also because the longer you're down below, the harder it is to get up. All the data shows it's It's very hard to get out of homelessness the longer and longer you've been in homelessness. And the whole idea is we want to keep any episodes of homelessness be one time, brief, and not, we really want to get out of that cycle. Someone mentioned generational cycles. And I think that's something we're seeing, especially with foster care, violence. You see those, traumatic cycles, and homelessness itself is a trauma, right? It is very traumatic, even sheltered homelessness. So in thinking about how we redesign our organizations and our programs and our partnerships to be both sensitive and responsive, but also more human-centered, because truly we're serving people, right? We're not the DMV, hopefully. And we need to be thinking about the client experience. I mentioned before, sometimes we have this false assumption that homelessness stems from a series of bad personal choices, right? And it's easy to then say, well, we're going to start making decisions for you, right? We're going to take options away. The data actually significantly shows that low-income people, homeless people, vulnerable people consistently make really good decisions for themselves based on what they have available, right? If you provide some options, if you provide clear examples of what's available, they actually make really good decisions for themselves. And it's hard to see sometimes because we have our own bias, right? But there is something about this idea of agency and advocacy. We need to advocate for other people's agency, not take it over, right? So this idea of optionality, when you think about someone who's a millionaire, think about all the options they have and all the capabilities I mentioned before, the idea of capabilities. They have tons of resources. They can do a lot with it. They have tons of options. When you think about someone who's chronically homeless on the street or a family living out of their van, their options are quite limited. And there's this aspect of trust and non-judgment, right? Trust a mother escaping a violent situation, that if you give her a suite of options, she will make good choices. And I think that's a shifting of the narrative of how we talk about homelessness, why people become homeless, and how to help them. Because there is a little bit of this like hero mentality that we build into our programs, which is like, I've got just the program for you. You're going to do this. You need to do all these things because you did these things wrong, right? And even if we don't say it explicitly, it's built into the programming. So if you can look at your programs and say, how often are the case managers that we have on staff actually explaining the program carefully? And here's the implications and here's your options. Typically, someone's just handed forms. They don't have a chance to read them. They're asked to fill them out and they're sent off to the next place. And so you've then sort of reduced that person's agency in a dysfunctional system. So we can make our systems more functional and make them, more supportive to options and sort of choosing and supporting those choices, whether we think they're the right choices or not, right? There's something, the narrative shifts. And the data does support it. It's not just a nice thing to say. People will make better choices for themselves than we can make for them. So then I do want to talk a little bit about rethinking housing resources. I know it was mentioned quite a lot at the policy level. I always stay a few levels below the policy fray because either I don't understand it or I'm not sure what influence I can have on it. I'm very interested in what goes on inside of organizations and how to capacity build. I think the hardest jobs are direct service jobs. The hardest work is small organizations who wear multiple hats, right? You're the service provider, you're the housing provider, you're doing this, you're doing that. And the people who do that work, whether it's you, your teams, but people you work around are doing really hard work. So it can feel frustrating. When I always imagine I'm frustrated when I go to the DMV, but I also imagine the person who works at the DMV is not having a great life either. Like, I don't think that's a great job. They're not happy. Like, it's not working for them, right? They get yelled at a lot. Like, they're not having a good time either. So it's not working for me as the person navigating the system, and it's not working for the navigator. Like, they're like, go to, aisle 12, and like, I feel like cattle. Like, I always feel like a sheep that's being herded, and it doesn't feel good, right? But to empower ourselves and to empower our clients to be better about reinventing our own wheels and saying, you know what, I do have some ability to impact the policies of my organization. I can make some small changes. I don't need to fix poverty. I don't need to fix California's housing crisis. He's got that. Those are things, right? That was, okay, that's what I got out of your presentation. I can't fix those big structural things, and I'm not trying to. I choose to focus on what is within my sphere of influence because it feels better and it fuels the hard days, right? This work is hard it can feel good to go and say, you know what, but I can change a few things. Whether it's changing a form to include a few more checkboxes, I know it sounds silly, but changing how we do the work to be more sensitive and responsive to vulnerability and to lower the barriers to access, because often we've built up barriers that we don't even see anymore, right? There's that sort of, why do you do it that way? That's how it's always been done. And I think if we can get ourselves more often, and it requires some real organizational cultural shift, have a meeting to look at, well, why are we taking 5 weeks? What if we could get it to 3 weeks, you know, before someone's connected to benefits? What would it take if we said, you know, someone's going to be doc ready within this time? You know, what if instead of serving just homeless, what if we looked at housing insecure families? How would we reach them? How would we make sure they understand that CPS won't be, you know, the first call we make just because they self-report homelessness? How do we reduce those barriers, right? Those are where the best solutions come from, which is why I would really stress, I don't have the solutions, you already have them. You're going to be the best process engineers for the systems you work in, and it takes all the strategies. It's not like, here's the one thing, go do that thing. It's all the things, and you kind of have to tinker, but it can be fun, and it sort of unleashes this creative aspect to all of our work where we've already seen the problems, we know them intimately. The fixes, no offense, they're not going to come from the state. They're going to be grassroots. They're going to be ground level, and they're going to be many, right? It's not one big sweeping policy bill that will do that fixing, but they're more immediate and more tangible. So a couple of things I'm just going to throw out there, and then I can answer any questions. Some things to think about. One, think about the informal affordable housing in your community that's not protected, but things like mobile home parks, which are often going away, but displace tons of families that have depended on that as informal affordable housing. Motels often function as affordable housing. RVs, I think, are underrated as a good strategy, especially we're seeing that with veterans, but also with families. So thinking about what does it look like to create safe parking lots, to create amnesty for your tickets, to create a relationship around who's getting towed and how they get their car back, because that could be all their personal belongings. Those are really significant cliffs for families, for anyone, but those are where you see that cliff becomes then insurmountable. You know, now they have no personal belongings, no car, and no house, no shelter. That's huge. And if it's a $200 fee waiver, that's the best money spent, right? So versus the billions of dollars, I think those are the small fixes we'll see more and more of, but you have to formalize them. It can't be, I know all of you have done the one-off mercy call. It's Friday, you're like, I just need this thing. We just got to do this for this one family. If it works for one, there's usually more. So codify it, you know, put it into your programs. This is a thing that happens, and this is our protocol for responding. And those partnerships matter, working with the police department to make sure those amnesty programs get really fixed, because it's like making vulnerability worse and worse and trauma worse and worse, and that cliff steeper and steeper. Looking at master leasing unit blocks, a lot of times you'll see that landlords raise rents because they need more money to make their business work. They are business owners. But if you can guarantee rents through a master lease program, and if you don't know what that is, I can explain it, but you can also Google it, just master leasing. It's a nonprofit or an agency that takes a block of units and just guarantees rent for them. That can actually stabilize the income for private landlords. And then you have access to units as needed. So if you have a family in crisis, you're able to get them housed quickly, either as transitional or long-term supportive housing. So motel and hotel conversion is the other way you see that. So motel vouchers is one, master leasing, and then just conversion. A lot of rural communities have experienced sort of ebbs and flows in population. And so back in the heyday in the 50s or 60s, there were a bunch of motels built. They're kind of sitting there dilapidated, getting funding around that and doing some fixes. Often you can cut red tape easier in smaller towns. I know it seems weird, but people care a little bit less. They want to see things get converted. If you can convert, you know, I'm sort of now serving South Lake Tahoe, and there's a lot of those dilapidated motels that are sort of prime for conversion to a different use. And when you look at the benefits to the community, to the individuals, it raises property values. Like, no one should really be against it. And if you can figure out what it looks like to either, you know, get a long-term lease on it or ownership, those can be really significant, because building from scratch is almost always harder to do than rehabbing. So rehab what exists, just thinking about the buildings that exist. thinking creatively about the space that exists. You know, can we have a campground converted to temporary housing if we have RVs placed there? I mentioned cutting red tape, working with policymakers at the local level to say, look, it's taking us this long to do this process. We'd like to figure out what it looks like for you to have one point person in your team to cut that red tape so that we can get this streamlined. Getting things done faster makes a huge difference. Like I mentioned, that speed matters. When a family is homeless, this is sort of the slope. It's like it's that cliff, and then it's just a steady decline. So really getting quick, you know, looking for speed. If it's 2 weeks, what if we cut it to 1 week? If it's going to take 4 weeks for them to get in because they have to save for a security deposit. Another thing we're seeing in rural communities, creating a security deposit fund that gets replenished because it gets paid back. When a family loses their housing, even if they know in advance that it's going to happen, it can be really dramatic because you don't yet have your security deposit back before you need to have another one. So a community fund for a security deposit for families to access with a payment plan, so they're paying it back into the fund. It's a pot of money that regenerates itself, but it helps bridge that weird gap between housing, right? And that's one of those life changes that if someone's like working 91 hours or whatever it is to be able to afford that, they aren't saving for a security deposit, but they have that money coming, right? They can pay it back. And I have a few more things, and then I'm gonna, so I mentioned that looking for gaps and duplications in systems. So if you're looking across your strategic partner network, who's doing what for whom, you often are serving the same clients in either similar ways or there's gaps. In South Lake Tahoe, we're trying to address the security deposit gap along with a few other gaps because we realize, you know, we're capturing this population, but not youth, not unaccompanied minors. Or we're able to help families that present when they're homeless, but not before they're homeless, right? So looking, where are the gaps in your system, your local system, and what would fill that gap? It's usually not like mind-blowing. You're kind of like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Or we've all been like, oh, I wish we had this. Go create it, figure out what it, like sort of do the yes and, like it's improv. What would it take to do this, right? Some of the best things come from, what if it was possible? Instead of, oh yeah, but you know, they said no. Just do it. I mean, there's something to be said for just being a little bit irreverent. That'll probably come back to bite me. So a few more things and I'll be done. So preferences for subpopulations. When you have housing available, try to write in preferences for vulnerable subpopulations, including unaccompanied minors, families, chronic, senior. Those are all subpopulations that are recognized by HUD as special populations. They really represent either vulnerability or a transitional phase of life. In general, I'm only an advocate for transitional housing for people who are going through transitional periods of life. Transitional housing is not really appropriate for seniors. That's not a transition, that's life, right? Families. There are a few places where I see it helpful. Transition age youth, so 18 to 24, also called TAY. That's it for everyone, right? Whether you're vulnerable or not, 18 to 24 is a transitional time of life. Re-entry programs. Rehab type settings and domestic violence survivors. Those are sort of transitional times. Everyone else really needs stable housing for as long as they want it, right? They shouldn't be, you know, here you have 6 months to get your stuff together. That's a huge challenge that we see. It's just transitional, but then no next step. I mentioned the security deposit fund. I want to touch on two or three more things. Transportation is huge. I know you know that, but if you can work, instead of just looking at housing, look at your transportation systems. If you can make transportation free in your area through some kind of tax, you know, dipping into different funds, that can make a huge difference for how far someone is able to live from where they work and for how they manage changes. Because if suddenly they're living somewhere off a bus route or they lose their ability, their car dies, that kind of thing. Transportation to a job and to housing, huge difference. Criminality. Oftentimes you'll see that people who are vulnerable also have a record of some kind, whether it's crimes of poverty, like you are now on a sex offense register simply because you were peeing outside, which we see happen quite often. And now that person can't get housing, which is so dysfunctional, it just drives me nuts. But looking at, you know, credit challenges, how can you sort of create funds that support landlords feeling more comfortable with credit or background concerns, creating more systems where you're upfront about it. You know, this person has challenged credit. We've created a reserve to offset any concerns that you have as a private landlord. Third-party payee services, where if someone has, you know, say they're getting SSI, it comes to a third-party payee and the rent is paid automatically. That just guarantees that their housing won't be a threat for non-payment. They may have other challenges. How they use the remainder of their money is up to them. But that cycle of, I got out of, I had to pay this off, and so then I couldn't pay housing, and so then I lost my housing, and so now I'm in debt for this. If you can get housing paid for through a third-party pay service, it is so worth it. It's not hard to do. My team is looking into it. There's a few places that do it, but it's called third-party pay service. Google it. And then offering maintenance and tax exemptions to private landlords, because often, like I mentioned, they're raising rents to offset maintenance costs, or they need more money. If you can look at, partnering with landlords to understand what would help them keep rents low and not evict, for non-payment so quickly. If you can say, look, let's set up a payment plan, we'll provide them the funds up front and they'll pay us back versus the landlord having to wait for that money. And the last one is sort of simple, but understanding leases and lease violations. When a family, before they're homeless, they're living somewhere, so they probably have a lease. And if they have a lease, understanding, are you on it? Who's on it? Is allowed to be there? Are you over occupancy? Are there income requirements? Do you understand what would cause a lease violation and then what the process is? So many people sign a lease and don't understand it, and they don't understand the implications, and they don't understand the process that might happen to lead to eviction. So that's when you get families coming in, we're getting evicted tomorrow. And you're like, there's so much that happened before this, why didn't you come in? People are not very good at understanding and sort of seeing their own, and then be sort of sensitive and responsive, seeing their own vulnerability to homelessness until it happens. And it's shocking. It's a trauma to be like, we didn't see this coming. And of course, it's easy on the outside to say, how could you not see it coming? Not everyone has the same language and understanding around leases, the landlord relationship, and doing education in advance around that, and then working with landlords as well. That is a huge role that programs like yours can fill. And I see it happening in rural communities really successfully because it benefits everyone. So that was a lot. I realize it's kind of spaghetti mode, but I wanted to kind of share as much as I can and be available for questions if there's things that I can answer. I'm also available just if you want to email. I think that information will get sent out. Super interested in what's happening at the operational level for organizations and agencies working with vulnerable clients and how we can do more of these small, like tinkering with, prototyping, piloting, just try it out. Get everyone to say, hey, what if we did this just for a few families? Let's see if it works. Or what if we did this for 6 months? Let's just see if it works. You don't need billions of dollars to solve those problems. It can sometimes be as simple as, we just made a new connection. And so instead of going through this whole red tape process, they just go to this one person and it take, a month later, they're not waiting for housing for that long. They get housed within 3 days. That's huge. That's a huge win at a local level for your families and for your youth. Yes.
So Cheyenne, somebody's asking online, how did South Lake Tahoe navigate getting the county on board converting old hotels? In Nevada County, there's an issue with the county not wanting to let an organization buy an old hotel because the county didn't want to give up the transient occupancy tax they receive from it staying a hotel. What's the advocacy pathway on that?
That's a really great question. It hasn't happened yet, so I'll tell you soon. I would say, I think of organizations as like a body, and there's a bunch of muscles you flex. And one of the muscles that you need to be flexing is strategic partnerships. And so in thinking about what it takes to get change done, there's what happens inside your organization, and then there's what happens outside your organization and all the partners you bring to the table. Get good at bringing the partners to the table, because if you don't have alignment around some values, like we value keeping people housed, right? There's like a basic, we don't want people dying outside. That seems like a basic value, but just kind of coming around that alignment. And then some general philosophy, like it makes sense to do prevention versus waiting till people are homeless, and some either on the compassionate side, sort of getting people to empathize with the challenges folks are facing, or on the economic side, it was mentioned before, it is much cheaper for cities as a system to keep people housed and served versus having them show up in the ER, taking in an ambulance, calling, the cops. There are so many ways that homelessness is very expensive to a system, but it's hard to really have a receipt and show that. But once you can get people understanding that and the impacts of homelessness on different programs and systems, and when you start having those roundtable discussions, county, city, all the nonprofits, all the state, anybody who's involved, all the stakeholders, do those meetings regularly and invite everyone that you can think of to come and start leading the conversation, right? We sometimes wait to be invited to meetings like this one, or just start them. Say, we want to have conversations about what the value of solving homelessness looks like in our community and where those resources look, where would we look? For specifically around the motels, I think that we sometimes design policy based on who has the loudest policy voice, which can often be people with money and influence. People who want to buy a second home will get their second home tax deductions. Homeless people tend not to be the loudest voice in a room around housing. And so we need to advocate and really help people connect the dots, because they may not understand homelessness the way you do. They may not understand the causes. I work with a lot of agencies where the city planning professionals that I am engaging with don't understand why homelessness is such a problem, and they see it as largely stemming from substance use. And so they sort of blanket say there's rehab or there's jail. And we know that's not the solution. That's not the solution. So trying to get people educated slowly around a round table where they have a voice, you're sharing information, that partnership will then lead you to solutions with them. So whether it's saying, what would it look like if we leased a motel for 6 months instead of having a winter shelter? What would it look like if people had stable housing for that period of time? And then, well, what would it look like if that was longer term? What if we bought it? Piloting and prototyping. You don't have to go all the way on something. It doesn't have to be big. I actually am a huge advocate for trying small things and lots of them. So instead of saying, what if we do this one huge sweeping housing, let's build, and just say, well, here's 20 ideas, right? It's like the toddler effect. Hey, here's, 20 ideas. Which one do you want? They're going to pick one of those instead of saying, I want something not on the list. Or saying, well, what of these 3 sounds the best to you? Well, let's talk about that one then, right? Do you want PB&J or pizza? And sometimes it's just about getting people invited to the conversation versus the no. I just don't take no. I kind of keep opening doors. And so make people your partners, make them valuable at the round table and drive towards solutions. You don't go in with the idea of the solution. You go in with, this is a common challenge. We all agree this is our problem to solve. What are your ideas to solve it? Here's some of ours. What do you think about those? Let's explore it. Let's try it. Let's do, so it's creative and it's different from how we typically run programs and organizations. It's sort of rigid and it's this way because it's always been that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Into now our learning community portion. And Cheyenne will stay so that as we're reporting out, you may be able to help us give some feedback on some of the ideas that people have. Okay, so first off, the hub, there's a lot of food out there. So I expect you all to get something to eat. Then just eat, because I can't take it all. I mean, some of it, but not all of it. So now we're going to talk about what we can do. So I came up with, talking with Cheyenne as well as Chris, 3 questions to ponder. And I don't expect anybody to answer all 3. My thinking is maybe pick one or prioritize one. We are a little short on time, so we're going to have about 20 minutes to ponder. So I'm thinking ponder one, pick your favorite question. So 3 questions. What are the barriers in our communities to developing and maintaining affordable and accessible housing? And how could we address some barriers? So make that one question. And then, as Cheyenne was saying, looking at the programs we have in place, what are things we could refine so that we might be able to identify socially vulnerable populations and respond before people become homeless? So my suggestion is pick one or the other. I'm going to ask at the hub here if you would get into groups like you 2 people here, maybe turn around and maybe join a group so you have like 5 or 6 at a table. Okay, like you folks can combine together. And then we're going to take 20 minutes, answer one of the questions, and then we're going to report back. And we're going to have to report back fairly quickly because I do like to stop on time. I'm also going to ask for one other thing. You should have an evaluation. It's handout number 3. For the online participants, I'm hoping the evaluation will pop up when you leave. And you will have your own evaluation. Please make sure to do the evaluation before you go. And for my friends here in the hub, if everyone who's capable could take one chair and pile it up for us, that would be a big help because we have to put all the tables and chairs away. And I have gray hair, I'm getting older. So before you leave, if you could just do that, evaluation, one chair, and let's start talking now. And if you need any help getting into groups, let me know. So let's. Okay. Oh, I've got to point. Okay. All right, we're going to come back together and we're just going to try. Are we going to be able to unmute our remote sites? Okay. Are any of our remote sites ready? Tammy, would you be ready to, oh, Tammy just left. Uh-oh, we have just Tim left. Tim, would you be ready to report anything out? Can you unmute Tim? Okay. We're gonna hear, we only have one remote site left. Tim, you're the loneliest remote site that's left. Do you have anything to report out?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Perfectly, yep.
You can hear me?
Yes. Can you hear us?
Yeah, so a few things that we came up with. What was the question? The second question. We have a person here that works with landlords quite a bit, and it's having she called it landlord engagement. Making sure people understand their rights, the lease, and trying to console the landlord. That to be a little more open-minded about situations. The other barrier that we have here is just, quite frankly, just the lack of land. It's either owned by federal federal government or DWP, which is a private entity. And so there's just no property to develop a housing units. And then the other barrier we had were people not being able to pass a credit background checks. And those are some of the barriers that we came up with earlier.
Did you have any ideas in terms of the lack of land to develop? That, I think that's in a number of counties in our region. Was there any thoughts about, are there any state lands or things of that nature that maybe you'd be able to access or look into that?
Well, again, probably it is Forest Service land or BLM land, and I don't think that's open for development.
Okay.
And LADWP owns a majority of the land here in the Eastern Sierra, and they are just not going to open it because of water issues.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Maybe somebody else had a thought about that one. Did anybody talk about any of these issues working with landlords or lack of land to develop or people who can't pass a background check that they might want to share in the hub or online? Oh, somebody has a phone.
Some of the things that we're starting to develop in Calabasas County is that identifying that those of us that are in social work don't necessarily have the right language and the communication with landlords as far as, so we're kind of going out of the box and we're looking at getting a housing navigator, but that housing navigator is actually going to come from the realty world.
Nice.
And so we're in talks right now. We've got a realtor interested in our community that we're having some meetings with because we want it to be where the landlords are being heard, because again, they're in the business for earning money and making money. So how do we speak their language and take care of their property and show that they have support for them to take a chance on the family we're working with? And then also, looking at the idea of the master leases and different things like that. So we're definitely in that kind of that direction and educating both landlords and future tenants so that they understand the lease and how to be with tenants.
Thank you. That's great.
Absolutely. We can't just look at landlords as the evil landlord who's trying to make all this money, right? They're trying to make their living as well. So that's good. It's good to
Okay.
keep in mind.
And Cheyenne, jump in if you have any thoughts, okay, from what you're hearing.
Any other thoughts in the audience?
Anything else from, was there anybody online?
Yeah, there's a couple.
Okay, let's do that, and then we'll do the room here.
So one is from Deborah, who says, the barriers at the homeless task force meeting is that both sides are very defensive and passionate that their side is right. Besides NPLH, I don't know what that stands for. No place like home, thank you. Nothing gets accomplished for over 3 years now. How do you break this barrier? Any suggestions?
Oh, okay. So both sides are dug in. And where was that person from?
Is she from Amador? Okay.
Amador? Oh, great. Did you have a good? We have a
thought.
We have a thought.
So a conversation we had at our table was around the political barriers. Rural regions, have very strong ideas about homeless and housing and projects being developed. Doing so, bringing more folks into the system, not really understanding that most of them are native from our areas. So really having educational forums that need to be set up so that there are panels and those folks on the panel can be asked questions so that it keeps it nice. Some of those educational forums can get, pretty sensitive. So making sure that they're heard in their communities regarding their concerns, and then really educating them on what's going to be happening from the legislative perspective, the actual volunteerism of what, the counties and law enforcement and hospitals are allowed to not work on and what they're going to be tasked to work on, right? The volunteerism is going away, basically. So the counties are going to have that task to them. And we want to make sure that they understand the different populations that we're serving, the struggles that people are going through, who we're prioritizing now, and how to set up a real crisis response system with less money, because rural regions do not get enough funding to assist all of the people that are coming through the system.
And I just want to say with the educational forums, that's something that we have done in South Lake Tahoe, where they brought in folks who actually use the warm room, and which is a nice addition as well. So people can see that we're talking about people who are facing the same kind of struggles we face. And one of the things I just wanted to share, as we were all talking about the people that we serve, we need to think about ourselves, because how many of our staff are facing housing challenges, right? Because it's as unaffordable for them. And that creates a lot of times empathy, but it can also create resentment. So it's just something to think about, is think about your own staff and the impact of housing on them and what they're dealing with. So those are great ideas. Anybody else have anything they want to share? That, because again, I'll put this together and then I'll send it all out to you along with a lot of other resources that we've learned about today.
Barb, I kind of promised people online because
go ahead.
Chris had so many good points as he was talking, and I was only able to get a few of them into the comment box. So
okay.
I saw you taking notes dramatically, and so I said that you'd be sending out some more notes around his talk too.
Yes, all of the, I hope, I think I hit most, I'll check in with him, but I tried to take notes of the resources that he shared, and I'll share them, if I haven't already, again, with everybody, as well as I'm going to share Cheyenne's information so people can contact her. And I think that'll be really helpful.
Seems like he'd be a really good guest to invite to an educational forum.
Yeah.
On
and one of the things that Chris,
housing things going on.
One of the things he mentioned is feel free to call him. His number's in the slide as well as his email address. but also he has an advocacy group. He had to leave to go and chair that, about 150 people throughout the state of California. So if you go to housingcalifornia.org, you can subscribe to their email list, which I would highly recommend, as well as he says, we'd love to have people join his housing advocacy group. So that way you're up to date on what's happening and you can share with him information. I think Cheyenne has.
Maybe you can flip over to the questions that I think are on the previous page. One resource that I wanted to mention, and it's both a good resource even if you're not formally involved in the campaign, but it's also good to get your county involved. It's called Built for Zero, so Built for Zero, and it's run by a national organization called Community Solutions. And they used to be focused on housing production. They were focused on building 100,000 homes. And they realized that that was sort of backwards from what they wanted to be doing. You can keep producing, but it doesn't mean homelessness goes down. So they then started saying, we actually want to get to zero. We don't want to build up necessarily. We want to build systems that get folks to ending homelessness. If you go on their website, there's a lot of resources and a lot of cohort learning that happens. They also have learning conferences every 6 months. You can essentially sign up your COC or your organization to be involved in this. And they focus on subpopulation homelessness, so ending veteran homelessness, ending chronic homelessness, ending senior. And they have all these strategies and toolkits for how to do that in your county. And some of the questions that were asked get addressed in their toolkits. So how to engage landlords, there's a whole toolkit. How to deal with this issue of community education, kind of bringing people along with you and getting alignment. There were a few other questions that sort of focused on those, like, but the challenges, the political environment, or you know, barriers to production. And in some ways, not all of the barriers are within our, you know, we can't influence them, but we can start the conversations that get everyone moving more in the right direction. And sometimes that feels like it's not the solution, but it gets you down the road to a better place when something is on the table. And I think those conversations are worth having because you almost always learn something from why people are scared, why landlords are hesitant, what they're looking for, and you can build better programs based on that. It's less oppositional and more collaborative. And sometimes it's good to not have a specific project or policy on the table because that becomes contentious very quickly. Just to say, we want to have a conversation. There's no goal per se. We just want to talk about, what do you think the issues are? Here's some of what we're seeing. You know, there's no goal that you're trying to get to. Suddenly the gloves are a little bit less, like people kind of go, oh, you're not asking me for something, you're not pushing something. That I think is a really good low barrier way to get people to the table.
Thank you. Anybody else want to share what you discussed at your tables? Anybody? No? All right. I will put all this together. I will send it out to everybody along with all those slides that were really tiny. I know I had a hard time seeing them as well. And if you have any ideas or thoughts for who you would like, excuse me, to hear from our May 13th learning community on the topic of bringing folks together around technology in rural communities, please feel free to contact me. Let me know. And take food back to your offices. And if you wouldn't mind, if you can, just put a chair up up here, pile them up. That will really be a huge help to us. And thank you all so much, and happy Valentine's Day. And take some chocolate too. It's Galentine.